Welcome everybody to our session in Ethno History. My name's Kristen Griffin. I'm going to be the moderator for our session today and introduce our speakers. We have an interesting slate of programs. We're each going to try and hold to 20 minutes, which is a very short period of time for some of these topics. And I'll start with our first speaker today. I'm pleased to introduce Wallace Olson of Juneau. Mr. Olson is a well-known anthropologist and an author who has been recognized for his many contributions to Alaska history and anthropology. His long career in Alaska has included serving as professor of anthropology at University of Alaska Southeast and participating in a wide variety of research projects, consultations, and training opportunities, and he currently heads Heritage Research in Juneau. He has researched and published several important works on Tlingit culture and the history of early exploration in Southeast Alaska. These include Through Spanish Eyes, Spanish Voyages to Alaska, 1774 to 1792, The Tlingit, An Introduction to Their Culture and History, A History of Fort Durham, a Hudson's Bay trading post near Juneau, Alaska, The Spanish Exploration of Alaska, and With Vancouver in Alaska. So please join me in welcoming Wallace Olson, presenting a program, Spanish Voyages to Alaska and History's Mysteries. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. Let me begin by pointing out that the Spanish were apparently the first Europeans to visit the coast. That's what we know now. They came in 1774, 75, 79, 88, 90, 91, 92. But those first three voyages are the earliest written accounts that we have now of Europeans or foreigners meeting the native people. And this was before the Russians and the fur trade, okay? And from the Spanish documents, of course, it's all one-sided. That's why I called my book Through Spanish Eyes. See, this is not what the natives said. This is what the Spanish said. But I've never been able to find an oral history or something from the Tlingit or the Haida explaining what they saw, see? So all we can go on right now is the Spanish. And so as I read these things, there's a lot of detail in the Spanish journal, lots of fine descriptions. But they also raise a lot of questions. And so this conference is called Sharing Our Knowledge. However, in English, there's another word called ignorance. And ignorance means you don't know something you should know or you'd like to know. So today I'd like to share my ignorance with you. And some of these things that are what I call history's mysteries. So let me begin with this. When the Spanish first came in 1774, Juan Perez was on the very north tip of the Queen Charlotte Islands, met the Haida, and the artist Mark Meyer, I'm not sure if you can dim those lights or not, but did this marvelous painting. Mark is an exceptionally great painter because he reads every journal and looks at all of the background and everything before he ever paints. And so here's what Juan Perez says. The first thing they did was to begin singing in unison their motet and to cast their feathers upon the water, as the Indians do at Santa Barbara Channel. But these Indians use a particular signal that is not used by the others of the channel, nor those under our rule. They open their arms, forming themselves in a cross, place their arms on the chest in the same fashion, an appropriate sign of their peacefulness. from what has been experienced with them, they are very adept at trading and commerce. And one chaplain wrote, these canoes come alongside without their occupants manifesting the least distrust. So the picture you get is when the Spanish came, if they're the first ones, these people were not afraid of big ships. They came out immediately to trade. Had they been trading with somebody else before? See, that's a mystery. And something else happened. Now this is kind of surprising. All of the journals from that voyage say that many of the people, and some even say most of the people that they saw had red hair and blue eyes. Yes, and now they had seen Native Americans. They knew that most Native Americans had black hair and brown eyes. But they all say the same thing. Many or most had red hair and blue eyes. Okay. And then they described something else. In his diary, Father Crespi noted that it astonished us also to find that the women wore rings on their fingers and bracelets of iron and copper. These things I saw on several women, and the sailors who saw them nearer assured me that there was also a woman who had 5 or 6 rings of iron and copper on the fingers of her hands. Now, where did they get the iron? It's not difficult to work copper, but iron? And so over the years, people have said, the iron comes from shipwrecks. Okay. But I don't think you'll find bracelets and rings on a shipwreck. Somebody has to make them. Was somebody else making them? Did the Tlingits know how to make these? Where did they learn ironworking? See, where did these bracelets and rings come from? Now, perhaps the survivors of Chirikov's voyage, 1741, may have passed it on. Maybe there had been Spanish ships going to the Philippines, galleons coming back and may have gotten shipwrecked. Or maybe somebody from farther south taught them ironworking. In fact, in the later journals, the Spanish say they were convinced that the Indians were making these knives and things. So the whole question of metallurgy then, and how these things came to be, is still a mystery. Here's another little example. In 1779 at Bucareli Bay, which is near to Craig today, one of the local leaders, a native person, stayed on board overnight, and they gave him food and entertained him, and they played music for him on their guitar. And then they said, in Spanish, con una guitarra en sus manos, nos hizo la viva señal de apertura de violón hasta del tono de música. He enjoyed the music and that we were able to play. Then with the guitar in his hands, through signs, he acted as if he were playing a bass violin along with the melody of the music. So the Spanish had never gone ashore before. There was no record of any natives coming on board at Juan Perez. So you say, how did he know what a violin was? So these things tell us, I think, that perhaps in the early 18th century, before the Spanish, there may have been trade going on, and we don't know what kind of trade. Maybe in metal. There's all kinds, and these, were not like strangers. Like the people were not afraid. So perhaps there's a whole period of history just before the arrival of the Spanish or before any written records that something else was going on that we don't know about. Okay, let me look at a little bit about some artifacts. In 1779 at Bucareli Bay, the Spanish spent 26 days on a survey out amongst the islands. By the way, those place names are still there. If you look around a modern chart of Bucareli Bay, south of Craig and Klawock, all the islands and everything are all Spanish names from 1779. And so they had a lot of contact with the natives, and they mentioned that most of the men, nearly all the men, carried knives. Even the women had knives, see? And they had, several journals say they had unusual handles. And here's what, but they don't describe what this unusual handle is. And so here's what the pilot, Fernando de Quiroz, talks about their weapons. The Indians are of good color and figure and strong, robust. And among the warriors that we encountered, there were a few who did not have many scars, which we were given to understand were from blows or arrows. Their offensive weapons are arrows with points made of shell, daggers in the form of bayonets without a handle, but with an end made of iron, which is shaped like a crutch or in a spiral. Let's see if I can get another picture up here.
Buttons at the bottom there, Wally. See the two that are on the bottom of the screen to the left? Those should take you, these guys who just click on that right one. This should take you there.
There?
Nope. No, you see the, that one.
That one?
That one.
Ah. How's that for a knife with a handle that terminates
That should do it also.
in a V? See? Okay. What's interesting about this is that's 1779 Bucareli Bay at Craig. In 1788, in Prince William Sound, amongst the Aleutic Eskimos, Captain James Colnett says this. He said the people had not much iron in their possession. The only pieces I saw were from one procured from Captain Portlock and a dagger shaped like this. And he draws a dagger with a V-shaped handle and a spiral at the end. So let's see. And there's a close-up of that handle. Now as you look at these, also this type of knife, this is an Athabascan knife from the interior at the State Museum. And you start to look at that and you say, these look almost to be manufactured. So how did this type of knife, which is rather unusual, spread or be seen amongst the Tlingit, the Eskimos, interior Athabascans, all about the same time? Are they all individually handmade? Or is it possible that somebody was making these and manufacturing them and selling them? What would have to be done someday then is to study the iron in these knives, and they're in the collections around the world. Some have handles like this made out of copper, but these iron ones really interest me. And so this is the kind of research that should be done, I think. Check out all of those V-shaped handled daggers, and if you start to find that there are several or all, many of them are of the same measurement, the same length and width and thing, the odds are somebody is making them and trading them. If they're all different, then they're individual, see? So this is a mystery about this kind of knife. That another one, but the Spanish, that's what they saw. Let me move on to something else about some artifacts. At the close of each expedition, there's one little mystery. I think I can do this. I think so. There's one little mystery. Maybe some native people can help me. In 1779, they didn't have any artists, and they make no record of the language. There's no, trying to copy the language. So I don't know if they were meeting Haida or Tlingit, because at Bucareli Bay today, that area, there are both Haida and Tlingit. So I don't know which group they were meeting or a combination. So I thought maybe some local people could help me. Obviously, that's a Tlingit or Haida canoe. Anybody recognize anybody in that canoe? Can you tell, do they seem to be Tlingit or Haida? I jokingly say, being a Norwegian, I said, gee, maybe they're Norwegian Vikings. They're all paddling on one side and going around in a circle. So who knows? But this is the only sketch we have of the native people at the time. Much later with Malaspina, there are many illustrations and artworks. So we can see up at Yakutat some beautiful things. But going to the artifacts now, at the end of every expedition, the Spanish would give a list of the items they were sending back to Spain. And there's long lists. And at that time, anything going back to Spain went to the royal collections, the king's personal collection. Over the years, that, okay, oh, I don't really need it.
Okay.
Over the years, that collection had been reshuffled and moved and put around, and it finally has ended up in what is known today as the Museo de America. And they have a beautiful collection of Northwest Coast items, really superb. However, in all of these lists of things being sent back, a lot of those items are not in Spain. We know that two, in Spanish, frazada, mantas, which means a tabletop or a bed cover, were seen in 1775 in Madrid, and they, but they're not there now. We don't know what happened. But several of them mentioned sending back one or two samples of these mantas, frazadas, made of wool, finely woven with a fringe on the bottom. And I'm quite sure what they were sending back is raven tail robes, maybe a chilcat robe, I don't know. But there are none of these robes in the Museo de America. And so what happened to these things? There were 7 expeditions. Malaspina came to Yakutat, and he said in one of his reports, I'm sending back from my trip north 15 boxes. Be careful when you open box number 15 because it has the odor of whale or something. But these are household utensils from Yakutat. They're not at the museum. So what could have happened to these objects? Let's see if I can get to the next one here. Nope.
5 minutes left.
Let me find some more. Let me explain. On this map, I just drew this, a little outline map of Mexico. You see a little sign that says San Blas. All of the expeditions, except Malaspina, went to San Blas, and from there the things were shipped overland 70 miles to the city of Tepic, from there to Guadalajara, and then down to Mexico City, and then to Veracruz and put on ships back to Spain. Malaspina's material was at Acapulco and sent to Mexico City and Veracruz. But if he said, for example, he sent over the time 70 boxes, and they've only got a record of a few being there. He said, I have a large canoe I obtained on the Northwest up to the north, and it's in Manila. I'll be sending that, None of those things are there. And so the mystery is what happened to them. Now, there were many, the revolution, the fight for independence from Spain, and then the Spanish Civil War and the Mexican Civil War. So maybe these things were destroyed, but perhaps, maybe, they might still be in Mexico. And we don't know. Now, the problem is this. I've gone to San Blas, which is a small place of about 5,000. I've looked through the shops. There's nothing there. I went to Tepic, and I've gone through the flea markets, Tangis, the antique shops, and I haven't seen anything. But you have to remember that Tepic is 300,000 people. Guadalajara is 6 million people. Mexico City is 20 million people. I'm not sure what Veracruz is. I think well over 1 million. There's no way a person could go back and look through the antique shops and flea markets in all of those cities. So my recommendation is that someday somebody get a grant and either take those lists of artifacts, have some sketches made, and get ads in the newspapers, see, in the big cities, and say, hey, have you folks seen anything like this? Or else take photographs of objects we have like that, send them to the museums in these big cities and say, hey, have you ever run across anything like this? Even offer a reward of some sort, saying that if you can give us information leading to the finding of an authentic, 18th century Northwest Coast robe or a helmet or box or whatever it is, we will get you a reward. Knowing Mexicans, if you sent the pictures and put them in the paper, somebody would start making new ones right away. So you'd have to have somebody check and make sure that what they're seeing is the original, the authentic. So I think, this would be kind of a great project someday. Let me end up with something with, if I can find some other pictures here. Ah, 159, 158, whoops. Ah, when they were at Yakutat, Malaspina had with him the finest scientists and experts, navigators, officers in the world at that time. This is the great expedition right out of Spain. And among that group was Tadeo Hankey, who was a real Renaissance man. He was a medical doctor, a botanist, a PhD. He was everything, and he was also a highly accomplished musician. And so Malaspina says in his journal that when they had some confrontations, a fight, not a fight, but when they almost got to a battle, they'd split up and the natives would then come out to have a song of peace. Let's be friends, okay? And here's what he said. On July 5th, 1791, soon after sunset, having established peace, the natives wished to ratify it in a most solemn manner. With this idea in mind, they started fires along the shore near the ships and began some dances and festivities accompanied by harmonious and happy songs. Now, harmonious can mean pleasant, see? In fact, one of the journals, if you're interested in music, Tova's journal, describes exactly how they were singing and keeping the beat, and he calls them the chorus master, would chant a verse and then the chorus would join in. So he describes how they were dancing. But at the very end, Malaspina says, which Senor Hankey immediately wrote down. And I thought that was lost forever. And this is Tadeo Hankey's Canto de la Paz. Now, I sent it to an ethnomusicologist at the University of Washington, Ter Ellingson, and he's an African specialist. And he didn't have much time to look at it, but he did say that this may show us, for the first time we have evidence, that these Indians were singing in harmony not just a melody line, but they were singing in harmony. And so if you look, I'm not a musician, but if you look at this, you can see on this page, a lot of it, there's an upper staff and a lower staff, and the beat and everything seemed to be the same. So on this next page, and let's see if I can move, there's 3 pages of this. Whoops. This is the ending page, I think, just to show you. If you look at this, you'll see that there are 2 different staffs, probably 2 different tones, but just a minute. Notice in a couple places that there's a different beat and a different rhythm going on. And this may be proof that the people at Yakutat were actually singing what we call today harmony. Now, when you look at Frederica de Laguna's recordings from Yakutat, there's only 1 melody line, see? But this may be a whole art form that was being practiced 200 years ago and has died out. But if we can find ethnomusicologists who could take this, put it into modern notation, and produce we might be able to revive harmony and song amongst the Tlingit. So these are just things that, you know, we have a lot of answers, but there's a lot of things we don't know. And that's why I like to say these are just a few of the Spanish journals and their histories mysteries. So thank you.
And I'm next up on the schedule, so I'm going to introduce myself. Again, my name is Kristen Griffin, and I'm the historian at Sitka National Historical Park. My background combines the fields of anthropology and history, and this subject is a very interesting one. The title of my program today is A Terrible Turning Point, Sitka and the 1835 Smallpox Epidemic. Before I begin, I will need somebody to let me know when I get 5 minutes at the end, if you can take care of that. But I think in discussing a subject like this, it's very important to begin by acknowledging what a tragic and powerful story this is. And it really has grabbed my interest, but I don't want my interest to be confused with not taking seriously the tragedy that goes along with any epidemic, and certainly with this one. So it's not my intention to offend anyone. Also difficult with a subject like this, can't do it in 20 minutes. I tried my best. The shortest I've ever managed before is an hour, and I promise it's going to stick to the 20 minutes. So what I did instead is I took a sampling of 3 different sources that give 3 different perspectives, and then to see at the end if somehow we can tie those different perspectives together to see how they overlap. A reading assignment in a history class a few years ago changed my understanding of one aspect of Sitka's Tlingit history. The assignment was a document known as Francis Chardon Laments the Destruction of the Arikaras and Mandans by Smallpox in 1837. Chardon was a fur trader at Fort Clark on the upper Missouri River. The document is a journal in which Chardon recorded the relentless spread of smallpox throughout the region. It concluded with a speech believed to be the words of the famous Mandan warrior Matotope, the forebears, just before his death. Having seen his family and many others die horrible deaths from the disease, Matotope knew that he was dying. His powerful speech brought into painful focus the reality of this part of the story of European contact with Native Americans. As I read the journal, and especially the speech attributed to Matotope, I realized how vague my understanding was of smallpox's entry into Alaska, and more specifically Sitka. I began looking for sources that could help me understand how smallpox had impacted the inhabitants of Sitka from multicultural perspectives. What I learned was that one of the worst disease epidemics in Alaska history started in Sitka. Smallpox, perhaps the most dreaded of infectious diseases, struck Sitka in the late winter of 1835, touching off an epidemic that spread up and down the northwest coast, the Aleutian chain, and into western Alaska. The epidemic waxed and waned until 1840, killing thousands, and in some cases, extinguishing whole families and villages. In 1837, when the epidemic finally ended in Sitka, an estimated half of the residents of the Tlingit village were dead. In the eyes of some of those who witnessed the epidemic, however, its end was in some ways a beginning, a turning point in Tlingit cultural history. When the epidemic struck, Sitka was well established as the seat of government and commercial enterprise in Russian America. It had been roughly 30 years since the Russians had asserted their claim to Sitka in a pivotal battle with the Tlingit Kiksadi clan. There were approximately 1,300 Russian and Creole, Russian native, living within the Russian stockade, and approximately 750 Tlingit living in the village just outside the stockade walls. And I'd also like to say that the study of population statistics is probably one of the most difficult aspects of history or anthropology, and you rarely get agreement. But in this case, the actual statistics are not the main point of my paper, so we'll just work with this as an operating assumption. The Russian-American company was well into its second charter, and Naval Officer Ivan Kuprianov had just been installed as chief manager of the colony. The Russian Orthodox Church, which the Russian-American company was directed by its second charter to support, was engaged in the process of converting Alaska natives to the Orthodox faith. After living for many years in Unalaska, priest Johann Venimenof had arrived in Sitka the previous summer and was still cautiously formulating his understanding of the local Tlingit, a people he found quite different from the Aleut of the Aleutian chain. From an epidemiological point of view, it is not surprising that Sitka was struck by smallpox in 1835. The reason has to do with both the nature of smallpox and the effect that the Russian colony had had on native settlement in Sitka. Smallpox is known to epidemiologists as a density-dependent disease, meaning it flourishes where there are concentrations of non-immune individuals. By policy, Russian colonists had been vaccinated in their homeland. Although the Sitka Tlingit had permanent villages in the Sitka area prior to 1804, the village outside the stockade had grown with the increased opportunities to capitalize on trade and technology. This provided the perfect demographic conditions for an epidemic, a community of non-immune people living close together in large numbers. In contrast to the amount of misery it brought, the actual story of the 1835 smallpox epidemic in Sitka is brief, lasting only 17 months. Some sources believe the infection was introduced from a ship that visited the port, but that is not well documented. The disease appeared in late November or December of 1835 when a young Creole boy living inside the stockade was diagnosed. The disease quickly spread through the Creole and Aleut populations, but the Russians, who were protected by vaccination, escaped sickness. By January of 1836, the first cases were reported in the Tlingit village. The disease ran unchecked through the village, causing 8 to 12 deaths per day. As is characteristic of smallpox, young children and the elderly were most vulnerable. The epidemic slowed in April, but during the summer and fall, flared up again in both Sitka and the surrounding villages. By May of 1837, the epidemic was largely over in Sitka. 1 Finn and 160 Creole and Aleut had developed smallpox, and only 14 had died. Their infections may have been blunted by prior vaccination. In contrast, an estimated 300 to 400 Tlingit people, roughly half the native population, had died, and most of those deaths had occurred in a 3-month period. There are a number of historical sources describing the European perspectives on the epidemic. This very brief paper will examine only 2. the doctoral thesis of a chief physician of the Russian-American company at the time of the epidemic, and the writings of Russian Orthodox priest Jan Venimenof on the Kolooshi, the Tlingit, included in his more extensive observations about the Unalaska region and its native people. In spite of its importance, I have no counterpart written source that can speak to the Tlingit perspectives of the epidemic the way that Matatope did at Fort Clark. This perspective, however, may be found in more subtle, unwritten forms, like the story of 4 carved house posts currently exhibited at Sitka National Historical Park. So I'll start with the doctor's perspective. The Russian colonial government had good reason to fear the deaths outside the stockade. The Aleut and Tlingit were vital to the colony's economy. The sea otter harvest depended on Aleut hunters, and the Russians were dependent on trade with the Tlingit for provisions such as fish and game that sustained the colony. The Russians fought the epidemic the best way they knew how, with quarantine and vaccination. To keep new cases from entering the port, Governor Kuprianov mandated the quarantine of ships, sailors, and cargo in the harbor. Russian doctors, aided by Russian and Creole paraprofessional medical personnel known as feldshers, tried to keep ahead of the vaccination by vaccinating as many native people as possible. The 1842 doctoral thesis of Edward Blaske is a valuable eyewitness account of the epidemic from a medical practitioner's point of view. Dr. Blaske had just completed medical school when he was hired by the Russian-American company to serve as a physician in the colonies. He arrived in Sitka in October of 1835, just weeks before the first smallpox case was reported. Blaske spent considerable time in Sitka and was responsible for the smallpox vaccination program for all of Russian America. The Russian vaccination program faced the same challenges that plagued the Russian American colonies throughout their existence. Alaska's distance from Russia made it virtually impossible to keep the program staffed and supplied. There were shortages of vaccine and doctors. Vaccine was commonly damaged or lost in shipping, and vaccine routinely became dormant during the long voyage. Blaske's thesis does not go into detail about the epidemic itself, but it concludes with a list of 12 observations concerning public health in Sitka. The first 3 address smallpox and reveal the unpredictable and experimental nature of early vaccination, especially in native populations. One of Blaske's observations seemed to suggest that vaccination during an ongoing outbreak sometimes seemed to spread infection. Thus, while the vaccination program was intended to prevent infection, it is possible that some of the vaccine used in Sitka could have been contaminated with actual live smallpox virus. This idea is shocking, but in the early days of vaccination, this kind of accident did occur. And there are other explanations, of course. I mean, if you vaccinate somebody who's already incubating an infectious disease, that could be an outcome also. But other researchers have also noted this possibility for contamination. Blaske's other 2 smallpox theses appear to be lessons learned through his experience with vaccinating native populations in the colony. In one case, he observes native patients in general having exaggerated physical reactions to any European medicine, which may have included vaccination. He describes elderly natives adversely reacting to vaccinations with symptoms that sound very similar to smallpox. These reactions were problematic enough that he eventually decided to stop vaccinating elderly Tlingit altogether. So now I'll shift to the priest's perspective. Writing about traditional Tlingit culture, anthropologist Frederica de Laguna has written that epidemics of infectious diseases were believed to be caused by diseased spirits that traveled in a boat of sickness, accompanied by the ghosts of all who had died of the disease, or else the diseased spirits were such ghosts, invisible to all but shaman. How did the Tlingit respond to the epidemic? According to Jan Venimenof and others, they relied on their cultural traditions, turning to shaman, powerful practitioners with access to spirits and spiritual knowledge. Venimenof stated that the Kolooshi believed that the majority of human illnesses were the consequence of corruption by sorcerers. In his 1850s History of the Russian-American Company, former company employee Pavel Tikmenov wrote that the Kolooshi considered smallpox a punishment sent down by an evil spirit in the form of an unusually large raven who dwelled in the distant mountain peaks. Besides seeking protection from shaman, the Tlingit treated smallpox infection the way they treated many other conditions, such as immersion in cold water. Russian doctors did not understand the cold water treatment, and from their perspective, that treatment in patients with serious fever led to the development of fatal pneumonia. One doctor, writing about smallpox at the Russian-American company's Fort Ross in Northern California, noted that the natives sometimes scratched the skin of smallpox victims, apparently trying to release infection, a practice that he had also seen with the Tlingit. Whether due to deep distrust of the Russians or the strength of their own beliefs, the Tlingit strongly resisted Russian efforts to vaccinate them. The Russian-American company had been attempting to vaccinate Tlingit employees of the company since 1822. Russian doctors did vaccinate 300 Tlingit toward the end of the epidemic before they ran out of viable vaccine. The tendency for most Tlingit to initially resist vaccination, however, was clearly described by Venimenof and other sources. Venimenof also reported a rumor that seems to suggest that the Tlingit did more than resist vaccination. After noting that the Tlingit wished the smallpox would strike the Russians as it was striking them, he wrote, "Many of the Promyshleniki, independent Russian fur traders, suspected that the Kolooshi, when selling foodstuffs to the Russians, put in the smallpox scabs." And this is, again, a really startling kind of a comment, because sometimes you hear about kind of cross-cultural use of disease in these kind of situations, but this is the only one I've heard of from the native population headed the other direction. From Veniminov's perspective, the greatest impact of the 1835 epidemic was what he saw as an erosion of the Tlingit people's traditional cultural beliefs, as the shamans' traditional healing practices seemed unable to stem the epidemic. For Venimenof, this made 1835 the most important epoch in Kolooshi history, a turning point that led them to Christianity and the dawn of their enlightenment and humanness. So the third perspective we'll try to capture, the Tlingit perspective. Historians do not have balanced information about both the Russian and native perspectives of the epidemic. Most of what is known comes from Russian sources, perhaps reflecting imbalances in who survived the epidemic, as well as the historian's greater reliance on written versus unwritten history. In addition, many people have acknowledged the difficulty of researching the impact of epidemics on Native people in general, due to traditions of not discussing such sensitive subjects. This is eloquently noted in Harold Napoleon's book, Uyurok, The Way of the Human Being, which explores the continuing effect of long-past epidemics on Alaska's Native people, something he feels has worsened as generations have avoided discussing the trauma. It seems likely that the Tlingit perspectives on the epidemic might be preserved in very subtle references in traditional songs, stories, and histories. One example is the reference to an epidemic beyond the control of men that devastated the Kagwantan. And I would like to thank William Kanosh, Sr. of the Eagle Nest House for allowing me to reference this story that relates to his clan and a house post that's on exhibit at Sitka National Historical Park. The 4 carved posts, which may be 200 years old, are said to portray a poignant survival story in which a young girl and her grandmother are the only survivors of an epidemic that has devastated the clan. The girl acts as mother to a baby eagle, giving it the name of a departed relative and nurturing it into adulthood. When grown, the eagle then sustains the girl and her grandmother with food. The girl composes a song for the eagle, acknowledging the loss of family and how she will carry on. The girl grows to adulthood and marries, ensuring that once again, children could be born to the clan. And I just realized that I completely forgot to click through some of my other slides, so this story grips me very tightly. My concluding remarks, where do we find any kind of commonality or intersection of these different, very complicated perspectives? So what do these three very different sources reveal about Sitka during the smallpox epidemic of 1835? In one respect, the epidemic that unfolded in Sitka in 1835 and spread along the northwest coast was no different than any other smallpox epidemic in the New World. As a human event, it caused physical devastation in Sitka's Tlingit village, claiming the lives of perhaps 14 individuals, roughly half the village, and leaving many survivors to face tremendous loss and an uncertain future with compromised health. As a cultural event, the loss of so many clan members surely disrupted clan structure, especially since those losses would not have been spread evenly throughout the village. As is characteristic of smallpox, the greatest losses occur among children, and especially the elders upon which the younger generation relied for knowledge and tradition. As a historical event, the epidemic highlights the difficulty of finding the balance in historical sources that allow us to hear all voices. Russian sources, like the writings of eyewitnesses Dr. Blaske and Jan Venimenof, contribute authentic detail to the historical record. Less visible to historians, but important to developing a full awareness of the significance of this event, is the often unwritten Tlingit perspective. Perhaps it is subtly preserved in songs, stories, and clan histories, like the one associated with the Mother Eagle house posts, which tells a story of terrible loss and suffering, followed by strength, persistence, and physical as well as cultural survival. And I would like to make some acknowledgments. I'd like to thank Ryan Madden, who was my professor at Sheldon Jackson College and assigned me that initial reading assignment that has been with me ever since. Catherine Arndt at the University of Alaska Fairbanks has done research and presented on this subject, and it's very, very useful. All of my colleagues at Sitka National Historical Park, Terry Rothkar, who recommended the Harold Napoleon book to me. It's wonderful reading. It's a very deep subject. And William Kanosh Sr. and the Kagwantan Eagle's Nest House. So, thank you. Okay, it's a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Ellen Hope Hayes. And my personal recollection of Ellen is when I moved to Sitka about 15 years ago, the very first person that I heard talk about Sitka's history was Ellen, and it made a big impression on, and I'm still expanding on what I heard her say those years ago. So Ellen is going to present a program called How We See Ourselves as Clans. Ellen Hope Hayes was born and raised in Sitka. She is a member of the Kiksadi clan. She was born the 7th of 14 children of Andrew and Tilly Hope. Ellen has had a long and extremely varied career in public service, cultural education, and as a speaker on Alaska Native dynamics. Her career has included supervising students at Mount Edgecombe High School, working as a ranger, a historian, and finally superintendent of Sitka National Historical Park, working as Alaska Native Liaison Officer for the Alaska region of the National Park Service, and serving as Executive Director of the Southeast Alaska Indian Cultural Center. One of her many current projects is a soon-to-be-published history of the Southeast Alaska Indian Cultural Center's first 30 years. We're very excited. So please join me in welcoming Ellen Hope Hayes.
My opening remarks will comment on the descendants of the experience of the Tlingit people in Sitka area with the Russian-American company. It was a commercial company, and their business was to go where the resources were going to be available so that they can have profit and good material, precious material. When the purchase of Alaska took place and the gold mining opportunities were happening. That's where my grandfather entered the picture. His name was Percy Lee Hope from King County, Seattle. He was an accountant. And when the trails were being made and the gold activity was high, he left Sitka, Percy Lee Hope did, and followed the process of seeking gold. So I have that heritage as well as the converted Indian. That's what you're looking at. I'm the third generation, westernized, Christianized citizen. Citizen is very important. We found out that as Native people, that after the purchase of Alaska by the United States, we weren't owners of the land anymore. We weren't citizens. This is was bought by the Alaska was bought by the United States of America. So our focus in survival and making it through this big change was our effort. So I just wanted to give you a little background about my family, and thank you for reading the history that I represent today. The purchase of Alaska, and I'll just mention that briefly, brought in a Sitka training school at the Sheldon Jackson College location called Sitka Training School. And the first students to Sitka Training School were the primary residents of those who lived in the cottages. And I remember hearing them call it the cottage settlement. It was non-traditional Indian, and there were no totems on Metlakatla Street, and there was no ceremonies of Indian ritual. There weren't any Indian parties because they were converted from being Indian to citizens of the United States after a long struggle to do that. Those residents that lived in the cottages, we sort of separated our thinking, at least as kids. That was the mission school area. Sheldon Jackson was considered the mission. And down here, going to the village, was the Sitka Village. And I was a part of both of those. And how we looked at ourselves, how did we look at ourselves, and what do we need to do is the subject that I'm going to mention. How did the Indians look at each one of the historical happenings that took place in Alaska? What we knew was that the Russian American company was located what we call right downtown, and we could see the events happening, but we weren't a written people, so there was no resource papers to be found or researched. But it was in storytelling that you could find reference made about how we saw ourselves. It was terrible. One of the episodes causing death and destruction from contagious diseases was mentioned by Kristen. And of course we survived that. Not well, but we survived that. We have nothing to refer to about any fragment of a story of stories that we told about our survival and our relationship with the Russian American company. Because we weren't written people. There wasn't an alphabet. So it was all in stories, storytelling, whatever was left. And I have in front of me a written list of all those historical events, but I'm not going to read it right now. It's quite interesting, all the events that were taking place, because this was the capital of Russian America. Yeah, maybe let me have a drink first. Thank you. Thank you. Trying to think of what to eliminate and what to keep on talking about. Because of that conversion to leave old custom behind, the main mission goal of the Tlingit people was to survive. And we were foreigners to the explorers, so they weren't looking after our interest. In the storyline, a flow of events, the Russian American company and Russia were looking at what was happening in their world of trade. And the Hudson's Bay Company was looming large. And Russia had themselves too scattered to be strong. And so they tried to get rid of, with some profit, the farthest south headquarters, Alaska. Which they did. And the United States was accused of a folly, the great ice box, Seward's folly. There's all kinds of stories to go in here, but Russia accomplished what it wanted to by selling to the United States. The tribal people weren't involved in that. They were attending the ceremony of it, but we don't know what their knowledge was of this event, of the resources that they were after and that Russia needed to get rid of. The Sitka Training School I want you to focus on that, because it established Metlakatla Street, the settlement, the cottage settlement. Gil will talk to you about that. Is it tomorrow? Yeah. I knew Gil's family, and I was a part of the clan family, as well as a student in a citizen, a little girl in the village. There's work for each community of tribal people because of those things I've pointed out. It's up to us now, to the tribal people, to find out this question: how do we see ourselves as clans today? We meaning from the elementary grades to older adults and elders. There's information, maybe there's information out there. How much information? We don't know. The clans have struggled a lot along the way to get where we are today. We survived the Ice Age, and there are names that refer to that. one man was given a name out at the national park of Frog Sitting on the Trail. That's a Kiksadi story. And that was as a result of the Ice Age and listening to nature and finding out how to move, what move to make next in that survival. So the conversion away from our culture and becoming westernized was where I remember how seeing some of these relatives of mine. They indeed were serious about the change that was necessary for them to survive the present conditions. Grandma had a formal hat. How she dressed was Western. It wasn't long before there was a brass band. It wasn't long before there was a dance band. It wasn't long before there was a cannery and cannery workers and cannery tenders and jobs and captains and crew members. These are all things that began to happen on our way to gain citizenship and compensation for the taking of our land. So those are some of the bases that I felt was important for us to do now as tribal people, is to look at the flow of history, all these events I've just touched on, just to name them, and see if we can add the our viewpoint, our perspective. As you mentioned, that perspective is hard to come by, and we haven't tried to do that. We're trying to get educated, keep healthy, hospitalization and health care. All those things were more important than getting the perspective of the tribe on major events. So those events need to be indexed. And then we need to work to see what their perspective was. And this would be our goal, to help them understand how things seemed to us in the process of time. Who are the local resources in tribal contemporary history? And I'll state that again. Who are the tribal local resources in tribal contemporary history? That's the last 100 years. Among us, I don't know that it's there. But our opportunity is here and now. And this seems to be the fertile ground, this gathering of sharing knowledge conference. Seems to me that there are significant growth, people representing the tribal community who can do this research. How do we do it? I don't know. But there can be an effort to do that. It's missing. In 1996, I studied this for myself and wrote a letter to say, it's up to us to do this as tribal people. How should we think about doing this? Is it possible? If it is possible, what part of it is urgent? If we're ever going to get a perspective from the Indian point of view in any of these efforts. It's not going to help us for somebody else to come and say, this is what we see about you, because it won't bring about any change. I wrote something about how separated we were from our old custom in a magazine that Rosita World put out in the 1980s. And it was my own testimony, and you all have your own testimony. It's time to write a journal. It's time to write a paper. It's time to encourage young people to say how they see themselves tribally, and to keep the flow of information from the tribal people before it's impossible. I don't know if it's even possible now. I wrote an article called "The Testimony of a Born-Again Indian." That was my title. It was backwards from the born-again Christian belief. There were people born again. And I wanted us to be born-again Indians. So that's the reason I wrote that as a title, the testimony from me as a born-again Indian. Beginning to find out about myself through my parents, my grandparents, how I saw things in the cannery, how I saw things that were exciting, the cold storage plant. How did we see all these things is necessary. And there can't be many specifics I can give you, but those of you who are native, seek ways to do papers, write papers, even if you're only 9 years old. Sometimes you've got the most candid information from little kids. And they have perspective about being Indian from the last 100 years of events. The other day I talked to somebody about Port Chilkoot. I was trying to find out what was the reason for Port Chilkoot. What year did it become military presence? And why was it necessary for us to have a military Port Chilkoot? How did the Chilkat Indians see what was this fort? And I think it was a training fort. What kind of changes did they bring about in Haines and Klukwan, especially? What was the intermarriage like that was taking place? Who are the descendants of that early period of time? Where are they now? What was their perspective of it? This comes to mind there. Karl Heinmiller. I don't know if he was in a partnership, but he bought the barracks. How many barracks? How many, Jan?
Nobody was in a partnership.
Yeah. And what Karl Heinmiller did was to use a program of development from the United States of America to hire Walter, who was the guy?
Porter.
Walter Porter, yeah. He was a dancer on the grounds of Port Chilkoot. And how I knew that was Karen Wind up there, my daughter's back there. Would you two stand so they could do it? My daughter Karen and her daughter Kendra, and their dad and grandfather Roger Lang. So there's that one question about Port Chilkoot. I think it's going to make a difference in how we say, how did we see ourselves? And what was important about Port Chilkoot as far as they were concerned, those who lived there. So we'd learn our own U.S. history as well as the Indian perspective. if there's anybody that cares to share any data at all about Port Chilkoot, I heard that Carl Smith, dad, lives in Haines, and he is an expert. I mean, he's a buff on Port Chilkoot. There were many things happening, and I want to repeat and repeat. We need to get the Indian perspective and try a form of some kind to be able to keep doing that, because I belong to the oldest generation alive now, and so is my whole generation. So we're moving right along here, and we'll be gone. And our perspective hasn't been shared either. I thought our perspective about, my perspective about the purse seining season. We had all kinds of seasons as Indian people. We were part of the seasons. And how did we, I thought that our heroes were the high boat of the purse seiners, who had a crew, and they were usually tribally related. And they were usually Indians. And we loved the high boat guys. We even liked the robbers. We had robbers among us, but they were all like Robin Hood, good guys. We knew who the robbers were. We had great respect for them. As kids, see, this is my perspective, that I thought was important people, and that was the purse seining industry. And the women who worked in the canneries, the canning workers, they dressed a certain way only. And you wouldn't come to work looking any different than the rest of them. And coffee time were with these tin cans that had sharp corners, sharp edges. But we just loved those coffee time breaks, even with sharp edges. Those are just sort of examples of things that you can get as tribal cultural change from the perspective of Indian people in every community. It's sort of exciting to me, because there's nothing I can do to change it. So I'd like to add to it. And that would be the charge. The Alaska Native Brotherhood was formed out in the cottages. Their first gathering and energy was in the cottages. And that's a subject for tomorrow by Gil, being in the cottage. And the, where's my water? Thank you. One more minute. The ANB had an annual swearing-in ceremony, a ritual, and whoever spoke challenged you as new officers, and it was called the charge. So here's your charge. Encourage our state of Alaska Indian people to document, even if it seems trivial and non-professional and non-scholarly, get their perspective. It always changes, your perspective will change throughout your life. Your basic beliefs are harder to change. So that's what I call the charge. And then right after that, onward Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going before. So that's your charge, and that's your introduction to the perspective that people carry in them, even if they don't realize it, about what they see and what they're experiencing. Thank you.
We have one more speaker in this session, and I'd like to introduce James Simard, who is a new acquaintance of mine, and he has the amazing job of being the curator of the historical collection at the Alaska State Library in Juneau, where he's engaged in caring for some of the treasures that we all use in documenting Alaska history. So here's James Simard.
I should tell you just a word about myself. I have professional training in theater production, and starting in 1985, I was asked to be involved in the creation of the Nakahiti Theater, which I did for quite a few years. And I continue from time to time to work on theater projects, most recently with Ishmael Ho, my good friend, on production of the Gunaka Day, which he had written. It's a touching story that we all feel very, very strongly about. I'm working at the Historical Collection of the Alaska State Library, where we're charged by the state of Alaska by statute with collecting, preserving, and making access to the history of Alaska, all forms of materials. And I just want to real quickly today share with you a few of the things that I thought would be of interest that are in our collection. Okay, so I just wanted to start you, this is the home page. This is all about, well, I'll just move on. This is at the Alaska State Library, the Historical Collections. We have done a number of things to try to make our materials accessible over the internet. And one of them is a collection that some of you are probably familiar with, what we call the VILDA collection, Alaska's Digital Archives. It's a collaborative project. These institutions that you see listed here, including the University of Alaska at Anchorage and Fairbanks, the State Library, and a number of smaller institutions, now including the Sitka Tribe of Alaska and the Sitka Historical Society, have collaborated on this project. We have upwards of 30,000 photographs and documents of different kinds, including oral histories, moving images, available over this site. It's a very small part of what we have in all of those collections, but it is available, and we consider it to be a doorway for people to see what's in the larger collections. In this site we have some written documentation. This particular document is the history of Occoquan that was written by Philip Joseph in the 1960s, specifically to go into the State Library to document his perspective on the Occoquan history. We have photograph albums. This album was collected during the Voyage of the Thetis in 1888 when Governor Swineford was first made governor. He said to the government, well, I need to see this place. It's a huge place. Give me a boat. And they did, and he spent that summer of 1888 traveling. This is one of the photographs he collected from Yakutat. Steve Hendrickson the other day was asking us for our favorite images that he wanted to present on the final day. I think this photograph is the one I'm going to suggest to him. I love it. We also have many photographs that are in that collection, including this one that you all know because it's on the cover of our program. Whenever I sit in these kind of conferences and I see PowerPoint presentations, I see images again and again that I know because I've had them. So we know that they're being used, and we know it's a valuable resource. Well, we've moved into another consortial project that's called the Northwest Digital Archives. And it's a collection that's containing archival materials put into an EAD, an encoded archival document that's a structured document that allows the collections to be described over the internet. And here on the screen are some of the institutions that are contributing all across the Northwest: Lewis and Clark College, the University of Alaska and Fairbanks, the University of Oregon and of Washington are contributing documentation of their historical collections. just doing a simple keyword search in this collection on using the word Tlingit, I've pulled up a number of finding aids. These are all documentations of these archival collections, including one from our institution, a guide to the Winter and Pond collection. There's one here from the University of Washington Libraries that's the Harriman Expedition photograph album, which is a very important album. And if you go in here, you'll see the description of it. So I've pulled out 3 of these that I just wanted to quickly show you. This first one is a guide to the Fuki Kayamori photograph collection. Now, probably many of you are familiar with him. He was a Japanese cannery worker who lived in Yakutat between 1912 and 1941. He was an amateur photographer and must have been well loved in the community. He was invited into lots of private events and cultural events. So this is the description of the collection of photographs that we have in our library. It connects back to our library catalog records, so you can request these things from us. It also connects to the few images from his collection that we have digitized and have available over the digital archives. And here's one that I chose in honor of gold medal basketball, which starts Sunday night, I think. This was the Yakutat basketball team, the A and B team, in 1925. These collections are rich in these kinds of information. We often have names of the people who are pictured in photographs. We often don't, and when we do, we always appreciate hearing from the public, when people can identify individuals, and we directly put that into the record, so it's available. The next one I want to show you is the Ethel Montgomery papers. Now, Ethel Montgomery, between, starting in 1949, ran the ANAC Cache, the Alaska Native Arts and Crafts office out of Juneau. My wife worked for her during the 1970s for a while. Ethel kept meticulous records of every artist that she represented, and let me see if I can show you some of those records. One of them was Jenny, who the Chilkat weaver. There are a few photographs in her collections, which are also in our digital archives. This is Jeannie at the Folk Life Festival in 1984 in Washington, D.C. And these are the kind of records that Ethel kept. This is note cards, and we have 5 boxes full, huge boxes full of these note cards, hundreds of artists who are represented. And she had a card for each artist, notes about when she began selling things for them and when they ended. This is a secondary card. Sometimes these artists have 7 or 8 of these cards, full of information, every item that they ever sold. And she had a habit of grading artists. Sometimes an artist would be making C work, and she'd note it, and then eventually she'd try to get their work up. She'd make suggestions about it. Pretty soon she'd be grading them A+. It's marvelous. We have not yet digitized these or photographed them in any way. They're in boxes, gray boxes in the library. But what we have just recently finished doing is making an index of every artist that's in these boxes. She begins with a collection she calls Indians, which she means artists from Southeast. And here are some typical notes. We've brought a notes field over, and we put just some significant things when our indexers have found them, like Charles Ryan, who was making A+ cracker trays. This is the next set of index cards is what Ethel called Eskimos, by which she meant all northern people, including Athabascan artists. That goes on, and I know that in this room there are people who maybe themselves or their relatives at the very least are in these cards. There's a third section in her records of people who are deceased, and I take it that as the artists passed away and their goods were sold out of her shop, then she moved them from both indexes into the deceased file. So these now are available this index, and we can easily make it available for people who might want to do research to find out what was going on with these artists, and then we'll happily go back to the individual cards and send you the record of the entire transaction. This is the third of the collections that we hold that I wanted to just make you aware of. Louis Shotridge, as you know, was collecting and doing work for the University of Pennsylvania starting in 1915. I think tomorrow there's going to be a major presentation from some representatives of the university where most of his collection is. But there was a small section of cards that at some point, and I don't know when, was sent back to Alaska and is now in the collection of the State Library. And they are, here are a few images that I've taken off of these cards. In his meticulous handwriting, he kept these over a period of 11 years. And these are personal genealogies. There are a few notes that might pertain. This one made me think of, I thought of Wally when you were talking about the first encounters. This note says that the four sons of this family were said to be the men who first, or who met the first white man on Baker Island. Somebody else would have to explain the meaning of that to me. Here's another genealogical card talking about the family relationships, the house and the clan. And here's another one in 1915. The previous card was 1925. These are all intermixed. He was very meticulous and kept this project going. This is another genealogical card. This one is a house card. He kept documentation on the various clans and houses. This one is taken in Sitka in 1925. And then this are some house notes from Plawak in 1916. Let me go first to this one. This is a card where he recorded, and there are quite a number of these photographs that he took. And these photographs are in Philadelphia. They're being digitized, and our colleagues there promise that they'll be available soon. But these are his notes on when and where he took those photographs, which we think will be useful. And I want to leave you with just this. This is a geographic name, because I've been listening all day to discussion of place-based education and the importance of naming places. Well, Louis thought the same thing, and he's recorded modern names and native names as he described them. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much. I've left my cards out. We supply reference service to the public, and please call us or write when we can help you find any records. Oh, and one thing that I forgot to mention was that we're so honored to be invited here to Sitka that we've brought a copy of the microfilm of Louis Shotridge's cards, which we're going to present to the library of the Sitka tribe of Alaska for them to have on record.
He used to do service all the time. So.
All right, well, that's our last presentation for today, so thank you everyone very much for coming.